I was living in France, writing something else, and it was winter. I met Didier in Dubai at a festival for my previous film, and he said to me, "What are you making? What are you writing?" And I pitched him this instead of the one I should have pitched him. And he asked to see a script a week later, and I told him I had one, I think, and I didn't, and so I wrote one. That's kind of it, and then we sort of worked together in developing it.
I mean, the character of Francois is a really complex one. I mean, you kind of can understand what he's going through and where he's coming from, and while you won't always condone his actions, I think there is a certain amount of kind of sympathy that you feel for him. I mean, was this a difficult balance to achieve when you were kind of writing, and when you kind of worried about how he would come across on screen?
Yeah, I mean, it's always the responsibility of the director never to judge your main character, especially for the actor. So yeah, there definitely is a sort of empathy with the situation. Obviously, the film has got lots of embedded details about South African society and the aftermath of apartheid. Yeah, it was a little bit of a challenge to stick with Francois, but it was definitely a very interesting experience.
I mean, in that, do you think the film's a very specifically South African film, and do you think the kind of meaning of the film is dependent on the fact that it was made there?
I mean, I think that different audiences have definitely had different relationships with how they interpret certain details of the film. Obviously, an Afrikaans white South African audience has a lot of information that they extract from a character like Francois. There's a lot of collective history, so I think it depends on the audience.
And Didier, I know that you were kind of the producer, but you were also involved in the writing process. I mean, what was your kind of involvement there, and how did you two work together?
I mean, Oliver was staying in Paris at that time, so it was very easy for us just to meet like almost, several times a week, and we were talking together about ideas, about the script, and it went very well.
Well, in Afrikaans, the title is Skoonheid, and in which is Dutch, and it means two things. It means beauty, but it actually means cleanliness, because that's kind of how they derive the term beauty, which is the idea that everything's very clean and very separated, like apartheid to Skoonheid, so clean but separate. The main genesis of the story was more talking about that generation of South African people who were at a certain age when the change happened and felt kind of left out of this extreme shift from being very secular and very separated to being kind of very inclusive, and for this huge change in human rights. And me trying to sort of get inside the mindset of someone who would have sort of felt left out, because I'm part of the post-apartheid generation who was young enough to be able to go to the right universities and have complete, access to all of the facilities of the country. So I kind of wanted to sort of just explore that fallout. And I think that it doesn't necessarily have to be sexual repression, it's just that sense of being the lost child of a country that changed dramatically in the space of 3 years. It did very well, I think, in the context of the fact that the first time the country heard about the film was all the press around the fact that it was the first Afrikaans language film to be invited to premiere at the Cannes Film Festival. So there was this strange sense of pride around a film that no one knew anything about. And then it came out like 4 months later. Obviously. And yes, it won at a South African festival. So there was this curiosity factor, I would say, around what the film was about. I think younger people definitely felt that the film was a long overdue sort of conversation about the politics and the repression, not necessarily sexual, but sort of general repression of their parents, because it's sort of our parents' generation that deal with these kinds of issues.
And what about in terms of kind of gay audiences? What's been the reaction there? Because, I mean, it's not exactly the most kind of positive representation necessarily that I think a lot of audiences do sometimes want. So what's the response
in South Africa? Of course, it's very difficult for white Afrikaans men of Francois' age to deal with Francois, because If you were gay in South Africa before the change of the government system, it was a crime. So for the people that sort of did what he did, which was hide their sexuality and sort of repress it, it was one choice, but there were also this huge community of men who defied the system and lived their lives. So there was this tension about me telling, or us telling a story about this character, which is a fairly negative character. But I think the thing about this kind of story in South Africa is that everyone has kind of got someone in their lives that sort of fits this narrative in a way. Rehearsals were for 4 weeks before shooting. We don't rehearse the script. I will kind of write other scenes for the actors to practice. The biggest thing we did with the two main actors is they never actually rehearsed scenes together, because I would do rehearsals with the two separate families. So Francois' family and Christian's family would do these different scenarios for them to get more into their family connections, and the two protagonists would never actually do scenes together. For me, the preparation for Francois was more about sort of just plotting the mentality of this character. And for the younger actor, it was more challenging because his character is essentially an object of desire, and he has no real motivation in this story. He doesn't really want anything more. Towards the end, he does. So he was harder to prepare, because usually with an actor, when you're preparing a character, you ask questions about, like, what does the character want and where's the character going. But for Christian, he was kind of just there. So it was the more challenging part. But yeah, rehearsals for at least 4 weeks. I think it just seemed to fit with the fact that Francois is a voyeur, and he watches things play out in sort of real time, and I kind of adopted that viewpoint as the filmmaker. But it's also because you've got a producer who allows you to really just tell the kind of story you want and doesn't tell you to chop off 25, 30 minutes. I mean, it's that opportunity to really just give a character the space to exist, and to really be fully fledged in the reality. But it was definitely an intentional choice.
I mean, in terms of the way the kind of moving on from that, the way the film's shot, it's interesting because Francois is a voyeur and he's watching Christian, and as an audience member, you become kind of part of that. So you're watching him too, and you're following him too. And I think it puts you in quite a complicated position as a viewer.
We do kind of toy with the idea of, you go from seeing things that he sees, and then also to moments where you're watching him. Which is the privilege of being the audience, and in some ways he's also got that privilege of removing himself from most situations, like in the opening scene, and I generally like doing that myself. So it's this dynamic which I think is very interesting around cinema, where we have the privilege of watching characters and not having to engage with them, and then playing with the idea of putting you inside their headspace and then taking you out and then putting you back in, and seeing how you sort of relate to that corruption. It's definitely open-ended. To be honest, the way that the actor and I interpreted that moment with the money could go between the fact that he was either just collecting money to pay his workers because he would pay them in cash, or there's the possibility that it was a bribe. But we intentionally don't really get too close to that aspect of the story, because it's meant to be sort of ambiguous.